I'm here with General Spalding, who's just written a book, Stealth War: How China Took Over While America's Elite Slept. General, it's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Great to be here.
So, very few books have been written, I think, unvarnished on what China's really doing, what their grand plan is, what their grand strategy might be, and your journey through China is one that I think people need to hear about. And that starts with the embrace and the hope and the beauty of the people of China all the way back to, I guess, 2002, with you taking Mandarin, learning Mandarin, and basically embedding yourself into China. And then over time, your view of that country and their leadership has changed. So I'd love for you to walk our audience through your time in China. Now, first of all, I'll give the audience a little background. You're an Air Force general. You were a B-2 pilot, I guess are a B-2 pilot, and became the U.S. DoD attache to China in Shanghai. And tell us about, just walk us through a little bit of your journey into China, taking their language, being immersive, and then when did you start to understand what China's grand strategy really was?
Yeah, so I was selected back in 2001 to be an Olmsted Scholar in China. It's really a wonderful program where three military officers in each branch get selected each year to go live and study abroad in a foreign country for 2 years. And at the time, you have to say, hey, what country do you want to go to? And I thought, first of all, number one, I wasn't going to get accepted as a very prestigious program. But number two, what country would I pick? And as I looked around the world in 2001, the most strategic country that I could think of, whether it's going to be a cooperative relationship or an antagonistic relationship with the United States, that was still yet to be seen.
Would be China.
But it would be China. And so
that happened to be the year China was ascending to the WTO, right?
It was. And so I applied for the program, got selected unbeknownst to me, and went home, told my wife, not only are we not getting out of the Air Force like I said I was, we're going to go live in Shanghai. And so we moved to Monterey, California. I learned Chinese over the next year, 2001, 2002, at the Defense Language Institute. And so we moved into Shanghai, Pudong, which is the eastern side, which is the more modern side of Shanghai. It's a new side that the Communist Party built up in the 90s, and got to experience China for 2 years. I studied at Tongji University, which is the premier civil engineering school in China, and traveled all over the country. And it was the most incredible experience. My kids loved it, my wife loved it, I loved it. We got to know the Chinese people, and they were some of the most hardworking, resilient, friendly people that you'll ever meet. And, at the time, I was like, this place is incredible. All of my neighbors were building factories. The Fortune 100 companies were building factories in the Shanghai Special Economic Zone. Everybody was doing well economically, not just the foreign companies, but also the Chinese people themselves. They were happy. They seemed to love what was going on. The thing that was interesting, but I didn't challenge, was that all the people told me, hey, we could never have democracy here in China because, the Chinese people really can't handle democracy. It would be too chaotic here. And, at the time, I never thought about it. Never thought to challenge that, particularly since Taiwan was across the strait and they were a very vibrant economy. But, nevertheless, I thought when I left in 2004, after that 2-year experience, I told my wife, I said, I'm going to retire from the Air Force and I'm going to come back here and
move back to China.
Shanghai.
So what changed? How did you start to see what their grand strategy is as a government, as the Communist Party's grand strategy?
It actually started at the Council on Foreign Relations. So over 10 years later, the Air Force decided, this experience, this language, this culture, that you understand China a lot better than most, and we want to push you to be the Air Force's nominee at some point to be the Defense Attache in Beijing. And so there's a process.
Yeah.
It's a process to develop you to have the right understanding, knowledge, diplomacy, and other things to be able to do that. So the first step of that process was to be military fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. And that was the first time I was really exposed to the business community, the financial community. And I had a really fateful lunch there with a gentleman that ran a hedge fund in China. And we had a conversation about what's the future of China. And I, believed at the time that their economy was going to stagnate. They had reached the end of their growth model, and they were going to have a hard time, establishing a high value added economy going forward. And he said, no, you're wrong. They're going to plateau for a bit, and then they're going to take off and then become the most powerful economy and the most powerful country in the world. And I said, that really doesn't make sense. I was still had a lot of hubris about the United States. We have the best system, we have the best model. We're going to come out of this, and there's no way that this is going to be the case. But that began my education on another part of China that, quite frankly, I didn't realize. And so I moved from there to be the advisor to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs on China. And it was at that time that I began to learn what it was to be a military diplomat. I began to learn about the Chinese government, and more importantly, I began to learn about the Chinese Communist Party. I read documents like the Chinese Communist Party Constitution. I don't think
So you weren't coached, let's say, per se, by the U.S. military at the time. They gave you a plethora of resources for you to figure this out on your own.
Actually, no. I was taught in the standard line of diplomats to have the same point of view that the last 40 years had been taking us. And so I was taught that if you want to tell the Chinese about something that's bad, like concentration camps or forced organ harvesting, always do it in private, never do it in public. And in fact, the Chinese would tell us the same things. Yes, we understand that you guys believe in human rights and democracy and freedom and everything. Just don't talk to us about that in public. Please do it in private. It'll be much better for both of us. If you do it in public, then we have to, be a little bit more effusive in our going against that. But we can certainly listen to your pleas in private. And so we were taught essentially not to air dirty laundry in public. And it really became, as I watched this back and forth, what I was supposed to say to my counterparts at the People's Liberation Army and what they were telling me, we were saying the same things. In other words, they had co-opted the diplomatic language between the two countries to the point where all of our talking points were essentially their talking points. So they had embedded their talking points within ours. And so
that's interesting. You're saying that not only can they control their own narrative within China, and they can use the Global Times and Xinhua and Taichin all over the world to try to control the world narrative about China. You're telling me that they can control the U.S. military diplomat language and control even that narrative when you're over there.
Right. And so one of the things that they'll say, and what Xi Jinping frequently says, and he says it at Davos all the time, is that globalization, we need globalization.
Yeah.
Right? We need to have open markets. We need to have, everybody should be getting along and we should all be trading with each other. And then, so.
And wait, what he means is he wants global open markets everywhere. He wants to participate, but not at home.
And I didn't understand that until, so this fateful meeting that all the people I met while I was in New York actually began to play into my learning about what was going on. And so in the fall of 2014, as I'm sitting in the Pentagon reading the Chinese, so there's a Chinese Communist Party constitution and there's a People's Republic of China constitution. Most people don't know there's two constitutions. Now, when you think about...
Wait, why is that?
So if you think about a country and you think about the sovereign of the country, so our sovereign, our State Department acts as a sovereign for diplomatic purposes. In other words, when it goes across, it represents the sovereign of the United States when it interacts.
Yeah.
When you talk to the MFA, or when I, and what's
the MFA?
The Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China, or when you talk to the People's Liberation Army, which is like the Department of Defense in China, you're not interfacing at the government level. You're not interfacing with the sovereign. Now, in the case of the People's Liberation Army, they are actually not a member of the government per se. They are the armed party or armed component of the Chinese Communist Party. And so when you think about a sovereign, what do? They control money, right? They control the police force, and they control the military.
Yeah,
right?
and the borders,
So essentially, all of those components are completely controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, as is everything else. And so when you go across and you meet with Xi Jinping as the president, in reality, the component where he decides what happens in the country is actually as the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party.
Correct.
Right? So he's really the chairman. And so when you interface, when our State Department, when Pompeo meets with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, he's not meeting with the sovereign. Right? You only meet with the sovereign if you go to the Chinese Communist Party headquarters, or some privileged people have been able to go to Zhongnanhai, but of course that's only if you're a special friend to the Chinese Communist Party.
And so haven't you been there?
I have actually been to the Chinese Communist Party headquarters once, and I was taken there by Michael Pillsbury. So I'm probably the only defense attaché
that's ever
stepped foot in the Chinese Communist Party headquarters.
And what went on in that meeting? This is kind of not really a non sequitur, but I'm very interested in anecdotal evidence.
So what I found out in that meeting, I was actually quite surprised. The Chinese Communist Party, since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, they realized that, hey, Chinese or communist parties are going away. They used to interface on an international basis, on a bilateral basis with communist parties all over the place, particularly when the Soviet Union still existed.
Right.
Now that all the communist parties are going away, who are they interfacing with? Well, I was surprised to know that our Democratic Party and our Republican Party were going over on junkets to meet with the Chinese Communist Party in the Chinese Communist Party headquarters. So that's one of the things that I learned. I was actually quite shocked about that.
So you saw congressmen and senators on Chinese cultural exchanges being invited into the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, I didn't see them, but that's what they said. Yes, we're doing outreach with your Republican Party. They come over and meet with us, and we're doing outreach with your Democratic Party. They come over and meet. I was actually quite shocked. I did not know that kind of behavior was taking place.
Sure.
But what I was getting in addition to getting trained as a military diplomat, I was also had another education going on. I was reading these documents, the documents of the Chinese Communist Party, and understanding what actually was going on. And so I started to realize that, in essence, if you look at the way the Communist Party works, it is about controlling the narrative. It is about controlling what you think and how you speak about the word China and the Chinese people. So now, even in the United States or in China, when you say China, ... what comes after that is a Chinese Communist Party talking point. The narrative that says, for example, if you bring up things like concentration camps for Uyghurs or forced organ harvesting, or the fact that Confucius Institutes do censorship of speech and suppression of religion on university campuses in the United States, the United States, you are being racist, right? That is a Chinese Communist Party talking point. I've experienced it many times. Another Chinese Communist Party talking point is if you say something about, Uyghurs in concentration camps or, the forced organ harvesting, then you just angered 1.4 billion Chinese people. So the Communist Party wraps themselves into this wonderful people and culture and history that I got to know and love in 2002 and 2004, and really takes that mantle and says, when you're talking about the evil nature of the Chinese Communist Party, you're investing that in the Chinese people. And it's actually quite effective because it shields the Chinese Communist Party from scrutiny, because people really can't accept that 1.4 billion people would be that evil to want to have forced organ harvesting. Right. And in fact, what I began to tell my People's Liberation Army counterparts is, look, most people in China don't care what you're saying. Stop saying, I've angered 1.4 billion Chinese. I remember all my friends when I'm walking around in Shanghai, I guarantee you they were worried about living their life. They could care less what you thought as the People's Liberation Army.
So you're saying that the Communist Party creates its own safe harbor, and its safe harbor is any criticism of any of the evil that the government is engaging in gives them that safe harbor to just say, you're just a racist.
Because right.
Don't worry about what we're doing over here, you're just a racist, right? That's typical, call it sociopathological behavior.
Yeah, because they're burying themselves inside the Chinese people. So because they hijacked China and the Chinese people, only they get to speak for China and the Chinese people. The Chinese people don't get to speak for themselves.
I want to go to somewhere that you and I have talked about before, because I think the listeners are going to find this to be fascinating. But you've told me something that I actually can't believe happened behind the scenes. And so you've been in the U.S. Embassy in Beijing and in Shanghai, and when you meet with the Chinese counterparts, whether they're PLA or whether they're embassy staff, you told me something that I still can't believe. What did they tell you? What did they say to you about U.S.-China competition when you would meet with them behind closed doors?
Well, what they'll say to you is that...
Again, in private.
In private. What they'll say to you is, it's our time. You know, for 5,000 years, we ruled the world. We had a bad 100 years. Most of it because of your fault. Because you were...
Their century of humiliation.
The century of humiliation.
Yeah.
But we're back, and we are going to be on top. And you are going to be responding to us, not
you meaning the United States. And you said they said we're going to clean you out.
We're going to dominate you. We're basically going to dominate.
The Chinese are telling the United States that they are going to dominate us.
And this is
behind closed doors in the U.S. Embassy or the Chinese embassies.
And this is pervasive around not just within diplomatic circles. It's also in financial and corporate circles. In private, they'll say, look, you better figure out who is going to be running this world and put yourself on the right side of that if you want to be profitable. And I've had, very wealthy billionaires in this country tell me democracy's dead. China has a far better model. And if we want to be on the right side of history, not only do we need to adopt that model, but we need to get on their side.
That's fascinating to me. So China is so good at using our own greed against us. And you say these billionaires are telling you democracy's dead, we need to adopt their model. Those are the billionaires that China's given special access to.
Right.
And made them wealthier to become evangelical about the Chinese system with a complete disregard for U.S. national security. So there's the idea of finance and the super billionaires and the people that run these companies that have big businesses in China and can't wait for more shekels to be invested over there. And then there's the national security apparatus here that realizes that China is our biggest competition. And in fact, they're one of our, quote, hard targets in our defense intelligence analysis. And so there's this huge gap between, call it gap in perceptions of the billionaires that have special access and our national security apparatus. And so one of the things, if we go back to, let's go unpack a few things you said real quick first. Our audience, I'd imagine, has heard something about the Uyghurs and the concentration camps in Xinjiang up in the Northwest. But let's get into more about what's happening. So I recently read the UK had a tribunal. And the tribunal was presided over by the QC that handled Slobodan Milosevic's war crimes trial. So they interviewed hundreds of witnesses that had escaped from Xinjiang, that had been released from Xinjiang, and even doctors that were part of the live organ harvesting program there. And when you read ChinaTribunal.com and you go through the summary of what happened, China and the CCP are actually taking organs out of humans while they're still alive and they're just paralyzed. Why is this something that the world doesn't know about? Why is this something that the press hasn't carried? We talk about it because we follow these things daily, but how does this get out into the open So that these billionaires that say, democracy is dead, we need to adopt their way. And does that mean we need to put 2 or 3 million people in concentration camps and rip their organs out of them while they're alive? What exactly are they saying to us, and how do we bridge this gap?
Well, what you're talking about is so horrific. Like when you're confronted with it, it is so bad that you really can't absorb it. And particularly, remember, as I said, that they've taken the words China and the Chinese people, and you say, a people couldn't be like this. But organizations, regimes can. We know the Nazi regime, we know the Stalin regime, and now we know the Chinese Communist Party regime.
Even Mao,
killed tens of millions of people.
Tens of millions of people, yeah.
So you hear it for the first time, and you're like, it has to be.
It can't be true.
It can't be true. It cannot be true.
When you read the horror that these people are going through, it can't be true.
And yet, we have one country to date that has banned traveling to China to do a transplant.
To get an organ.
To get an organ.
And who is that?
And that is Israel. And the reason Israel banned it is because a heart surgeon, who happened to also be the head of the Organ Transplant Association within Israel
Yes.
at the time, heard from his patient that he was going next month to get a heart transplant.
He was making an appointment to get a heart transplant.
He had made an appointment.
Right, but it was a month out.
It was a month out.
Right, so normally, if you're on the heart transplant waiting list, you get a call and you have to fly somewhere within 12 hours to get a heart transplant.
And you have to be in a
China,
certain
you can make an appointment to get a
You
heart
can get an
transplant.
appointment. And so the heart surgeon said, "What do you mean you've made an appointment?" And so he began to investigate. And what he found was the Chinese Communist Party in their People's Liberation Army hospitals were essentially taking the Falun Gong, and in some cases, and the Uyghurs, and in some case, dissident Christians. It all depends on if you're matched. The reason that they know that this is going on, because some people leave that, and they say, "Hey, my DNA was checked, and they did an ultrasound on me."
Right.
Right.
So when China brings in what they call prisoners of conscience,
Right.
which are various religious groups and dissident groups,
Right.
they tissue type them, they blood test them,
Yes.
and they ultrasound them.
They ultrasound them.
And they do it with every prisoner. So
Every
they have a
prisoner.
buffet line of organs
Right.
to choose from.
And so what the heart surgeon found out is that this was going on. So he also happened to be, a survivor. He came from survivors of the Holocaust. And he clearly recognized the same kind of conditions that existed under the Nazis with going on within the Chinese Communist Party. Yeah, and I think it goes to show you that there's no morals invested or human dignity or human rights invested in the Chinese Communist Party. It is really about as evil an organization, not because the Chinese people are evil, but because it seeks only power and control. And essentially, these are the things so he got Israel to say, we're going to ban this. So now you can't go from Israel to get an organ transplant, but you can go from anywhere else.
So to be clear, if you're in the U.S. or Europe and you want to make an appointment to go get an organ transplant in China, you
can do it.
If you figure out who to call, you just call them up, make an appointment.
Right. And it's
go
going to cost you some money, a lot of money.
Yeah.
This, by the way, the interesting thing about how Deng Xiaoping morphed communism in order to unlock the potential that China's experience was really to tie the human profit motive to the Communist Party's national interest. And so that's a very powerful formula for development and economic growth and social development. And it's what we have owned the patent on that. We had owned the patent on that. What they did is say, okay, we're going to, in a very narrow area, we're going to allow you to get rich. But in all these other areas, we're going to dictate what it is. The Communist Party is going to dictate.
You're right. I would say, more importantly, we'll choose the people that we want to make rich. And they'll become evangelists, and more importantly, lobbyists for the Chinese way, the CCP way of life and business in the U.S. So some of China's top lobbyists are U.S. billionaires.
Right. And so when you look at kind of the end of World War II and the world that we tried to create, this idea of democratic principles, civil liberties, human rights, rule of law went hand in hand with the idea of free trade. So there wasn't just free trade or globalization. Right. There were principles built into that. And then self-determination. So all of these things, it's in the Atlanta Charter, one page, you can read it and you can see, hey, this is a template for what we wanted to build. Well, China took that and said, hey, throw all that other stuff away. We're going to go with globalization.
We're going to go with free trade and forget about those other things.
And we're going to create a culture that only is about getting rich, and then we're going to control that. And so when you do that, when you take morality out, when you take human rights and civil liberties out, and you turn people that the Chinese company, so Jiang Zemin said, destroy the Falun Gong. Literally destroy the people that practice Falun Gong. When he did that, he created an opportunity for the People's Liberation Army to make a profit. So they created these things and said, hey, he said destroy these people. He didn't say that we couldn't make a buck on it. And so they did. They created a business. And in China, if you want to create a business, as long as it doesn't challenge the Communist Party, everything's okay. So fentanyl. Fentanyl is a good example of this. It comes right out of the pharmaceutical factories, the same factories that are producing
core factories
the core factories that are producing all the drugs, generic drugs that come across from China. Yeah. That's where they're producing the fentanyl, and it's just another business for them.
It's what's interesting about the fentanyl. So we've gone. This is the. So let me go back to cover one more item on the concentration camps, the Uyghurs. U.S. intelligence believes it's up to 3 million people now. 3 million people in concentration camps. And we have satellite images, Israel has satellite images, that Europe has satellite images of what's happening in Xinjiang. Right? It's one of the benefits of global technology. And when they started building the crematoria there, that should have been an interesting red flag moment. Right. That you're building concentration camps and cremation facilities in the same place. I don't think that they're vertically integrating because they think it's a good idea over time to be able to dispose of bodies. Right. Why hasn't the U.S. banned, call it organ travel? Why hasn't the West decided to do what Israel's done? Why are we not making this front page news all the time? The New York Times did a really interesting multi-day write-up on the Uyghurs and the concentration camps, and then it just kind of went away. Yeah. Why aren't we talking about it more?
So in addition to controlling the narrative on China and the Chinese people, they also are expert at obfuscation. So when you look across the world and you look at the two biggest nations creating influence around the world, there's Russians who do atomization. They basically break up populations. They create division between neighbors. The Chinese come in, and underneath that, they hide everything they do. And the Communist Party is one of the best organizations ever in history at keeping a secret about everything it does. And so...
And you mean a secret about its grand strategy?
A secret about everything.
Yeah.
Even our intelligence community, has an almost impossible time trying to piece together what's going on because they have a great system of essentially hiding everything they do. It's built in to how they operate the Communist Party because it operates as a veneer over the society. Yeah. So when you control the narrative on China and the Chinese people and you hide everything you're doing, right. It's not exposed. We need facts here.
The secret of Xinjiang is none of our cameras are rolling inside there.
Right.
The nightmare for the Communist Party has been Hong Kong, because in Hong Kong they want to squash the rebellion. They want to basically annex Hong Kong.
And cameras are there.
And the cameras are everywhere.
Rolling. Yeah.
And no matter how they try to change a narrative, the West has been able to say, you guys are full of shit.
Dress people
right?
in the uniforms of the Hong Kong
and in
police
Xinjiang,
or whatever.
They close roads. The CNN tries to get in there. Vice tries to get in there. They won't let you in.
So, I mean, if you go back...
So that's it. Basically, they're able to just hide 3 million people in political prisons and getting
Right.
organs ripped out.
Right, and of course, if you land there, they'll put an app on your phone so that they're making sure that they know what you're doing with your phone. They basically lock everything down, both physically and electronically. Think about what the U.S. Army soldiers experienced when they walked in the Dachau. I mean, the horror that they witnessed. And yet, this was known by people, and it was talked about. But even at the time, people could not imagine that the
Couldn't
Nazis
fathom the evil.
could be so evil.
Right.
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 So it's very similar
Okay.
situation that's going on today.
So let's move to fentanyl, generic drug. So when I look at fentanyl and what's happening, and again, I'm not an expert in this space, but I've talked to experts. We lost like 75,000 lives to opioids last year alone.
Right.
We think 48 to 50,000 of them were fentanyl deaths. And 90% plus of the fentanyl that comes into the U.S. comes from China. So just using deductive logic, the Chinese government is killing 40,000 Americans a year on purpose, i.e. just shipping us our own death drugs. And so we went to war in the Middle East over September 11th, which was a horrible day in the lives of our country and the life of our country, and they killed about 3,000 people. So they're killing 40,000 a year, and what are we doing about it?
Well, I mean, not just killing 40,000 people a year. You have to go back to those same communities and say, what happened first? What happened first is
right.
when
They
they
hollowed us out
joined the
first.
WTO in 2001, we lost over 70,000 factories, 3.4 million manufacturing jobs, add 4 support jobs for each one of those, so over 13 million jobs. So they took away America's factories, took away their jobs, and because those jobs were long-term jobs with health care, they took away their health care, and they took away their retirement funds.
Right.
And so they left those communities destitute. And then they started sending in the drugs and killing them. And yes, it's not because Xi Jinping said, sell Americans fentanyl. What they said was, we don't care what you do as long as it employs Chinese and makes money. I can tell you that the profit motive in China is alive and strong, and those guys that run pharmaceutical companies are making a ton of money that are cranking out fentanyl and shipping it to the United States. Now, the interesting thing is when you go and talk to our drug enforcement officials, like I have, they'll tell you the Chinese are cooperating with us. And I almost fell out of my chair, and I said, they're shipping in 100% of the fentanyl that comes into the United States, either through the southern border, through the precursors, or directly shipped to you in the mail through the Postal Service, or coming as pressed pills from Canada. It's all coming from China. And they said, well, yeah, but when we go over and we say, hey, you know, they've changed the chemical composition of fentanyl just to make it, now it's legal. Can you make that illegal and stop it? And they'll say, well, you know, it usually takes us a year to get that through the process, but for you, we'll do it in 6 months, and then we'll roll up a couple of these guys and we'll put them in jail. Of course, 2 weeks later, they're out.
Right.
And then certainly 6 months later, they say, hey, this thing's no longer legal, and they just change the formulation again.
It feels
But
to
we
me-
feel, because of that, because they say that, those words to us, oh, they must be cooperating with us, when in fact, they're not.
They're dialing it up.
The flow hasn't changed one
No,
bit.
yes, it has. It's gotten more. It's gotten
Well,
greater.
yes.
The flow continues to increase. It feels to me like a reverse opium war.
It is very much a reverse opium war. If you talk to them in private, I'm sure that they would giggle about it. To them, it's humorous.
The story that I just read is they've genetically modified the poppy plant so that it can grow year-round instead of just half the year.
I hadn't heard that.
So this is a story that just came out in one of the medical journals a week ago, where they said their poppy crop is now up 40% because they can grow plants year-round. Now, why it hasn't doubled, I'm not sure, but maybe it's harder to grow, you know, in the wintertime. But point being is we have gross human rights violations. We have one could deem to be an attack on the United States. And then when we get out of fentanyl, we get into the generic drugs and what they're doing there with the residuals being carcinogenic, and they own that business. Again, every time you look under a rock in our relationship with China, it just seems to get worse and worse.
Yeah.
And it gets worse everywhere I look.
Right.
So why do you think we as a country why do you think we even engage with them? Is it only because our profit motive, because of our greed and our desire to chase El Dorado and the 1.4 billion Chinese? Why don't we open our eyes and say we're not going to interface with an evil regime?
Yeah.
What's your view? How do we fix this?
I'll tell you why we don't recognize it. We don't understand China or the Chinese Communist Party. Now, when I went over in 2002 and had my first meal in a Chinese restaurant, and I got the check, and I didn't get a fortune cookie, I was like, where's my fortune cookie? I didn't know realize till that moment that fortune cookies don't come from China. They actually come from the United States. It was made by a Japanese guy in San Francisco. And then all of a sudden it caught on as a thing for Chinese restaurants in the United States, but it's not actually. So what we know about the Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party, well, who was supposed to warn us about this were the experts on China. Now, why didn't the experts on China warn us about the Chinese Communist Party? They were going over on junkets.
Yeah.
Paid for by the Chinese Communist Party, granted visas by the Chinese Communist Party. Bloomberg did a fantastic article on Xi Jinping's family when he took power and how wealthy they had become. And Michael Bloomberg was warned, if you don't stop this, your Bloomberg terminals will not work in China anymore.
In fact, they turned them off for a while.
And then
this is the Beaujolais story.
And all of a sudden,
yeah.
Bloomberg's self-censoring when it comes to reporting about the Chinese Communist Party.
It's actually worse than that. I think Bloomberg has gone on the offensive against China hawks.
Well, I think so, because if you think about it, globalization actually helps Wall Street, right?
Yes.
Because they earn a fee on equities or bonds.
Bloomberg wants to sell more terminals.
Bloomberg wants to sell more.
BlackRock wants more money.
Right, exactly. It's all
the casinos want more gambling. They want this financial integration.
Yeah, my point about tying the profit incentive to Chinese Communist Party national interests, it doesn't just work in China. It works here too.
Yeah.
It works in Europe. It works in Africa. It works in Asia. All you have to do is figure out, how do I get you incentivized financially or economically?
Yeah.
And then you'll do what I want.
So
how do we fix it?
Yeah.
Right. You asked how do we fix it? Well, one of the ways that you could fix it, and I'm specifically talking about fentanyl now. Find one. So we just recently in Philadelphia at the port there, or it might have been Baltimore, found something like $100 million worth of fentanyl on a ship. Now, the first time that the U.S. government says, if we find one bit of fentanyl on any ship, we're turning every single ship back, and you won't get a ship in the port for a month. And not only that, we're going to charge you for everything that was offloaded a $1,000 fine. The next time it comes in, it's going to be double.
Why not charge them for the full value of the shipment? Why not say the shipping company is going to owe $100 million for this?
And then when you do, ICBC's got a great building in New York City. AVIC has a number of assets.
Bank of China has a huge building in New York.
And you say, okay, guess what? We're going to take that.
Yeah.
As compensation.
Yeah.
When you start levying penalties on the Communist Party.
And on their assets.
And on their assets.
Yeah.
And on the nation itself, because the Communist Party is a sovereign,
yeah.
Then you get behavior to change. Until you do that, if you go after companies or individuals, which is what we tend to do in a country that's about the rule of law, they're going to say, we don't care. Just like they can harvest your organs as a Falun Gong, if you're a fentanyl producer in China and you happen to be rolled up by a U.S. Indictment.
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
There are 1.399 billion
we got more
we
of
can
them.
go to.
Go have at it.
Yeah. Okay. In your book, which your book is, I found your book, I hope this isn't a negative, but I found it to be a series of amazing short stories.
Right.
Right? It is telling a greater narrative, but I found each chapter to be fascinating because it was kind of a start and a finish at every chapter. In one of the chapters, you talk about how China is actually censoring and coming after voices of opposition in the United States.
Right.
Talk to me about how they do that.
So the first time I experienced this firsthand, I actually came over with General Fang Fenghui, who was the chief of the general staff for the People's Liberation Army. As
Came
he,
over, meaning from China
From
to the
China
United
to the
States.
U.S.
So you escorted the Chinese general.
I escorted him to Mar-a-Lago for the first bilateral meeting between Xi Jinping and President Trump. And on the way back, so we flew out of Miami, flew to New York, got and transferred from New York, flew back to Beijing. From Miami to New York, I get in the plane. I'm in the back of the plane. All the PLA is in the front of the plane. And in the back of the plane, I noticed
Is it
that
a commercial flight?
it's a commercial flight. In the back of the plane, I noticed that there's all these Chinese people, and they're speaking Chinese. So
Which you speak.
which I speak. So I started speaking to them. Hey, how's it going? What's going on? Then I noticed they had bandages and kind of scraped up. And I'm like, hey, what's going on?
What happened to you guys?
And they said, oh, we're Falun Gong. You know, the embassy sent some people down to beat us up. We were protesting Xi.
The Chinese embassy sent thugs to beat up protesters in the United States.
In the United States. And so what happens whenever you have a head of state, so Xi Jinping, come to the United States? This happened in September of 2015 when he came to meet President Obama in Washington, D.C., is the embassy will make a call out to all the visa holders, students, you know, business, people that are on business visa.
Any ethnic Chinese person in the U.S.
Anybody that's a Chinese national in the U.S., in the region, come out, will line the streets of the approach.
So they're instructed to line the streets.
They're instructed to line the streets of the approach to ensure that no protests happen. If a protester shows up, what they're trained to do is essentially surround the protester and then beat them so that you can't notice. And so they are essentially establishing sovereignty
in the United
States, sovereignty over the territory where the Communist Party leaders. They were doing the same thing.
So did we arrest any of the people that beat these Falun Gong?
No, we didn't. In
Why
fact,
not?
you know, well, primarily the reason we haven't done any kind of enforcement whatsoever, ZTE on the entity list, could have been done during the Obama administration.
Huawei on
but the
the
State
entity
Department said, no, we're not going to do enforcement on them because we want the Communist Party to agree with us on North Korea and climate change.
I see.
So we're not going to.
We were willing to let many wrongs happen in the interest of maybe achieving some foreign policy goal.
Every wrong.
We would let them
wrong.
execute all the wrongs.
All the wrongs, because it was more important that we had this, what we viewed to be mutually beneficial cooperative relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. Nobody went over to the Communist Party side and said, do you guys want a mutually beneficial cooperative relationship? Because they would have said, hell no, you're our enemy. You guys created, you were the ones that forced us through the century of humiliation.
That's important, right? Because the people that believe that we should just prostrate ourselves once again and just get a deal done and deal with China and make another paycheck and earn some more money for the billionaires, those people believe there's a symbiotic relationship when it's truly parasitic.
Yeah. And it's interesting because they'll say what I just said right now is not true because there are reformers in the Chinese Communist Party. And what they don't understand is the reformers still believe in what I'm saying. They're just willing to go a different way at it.
Correct.
Right? So rather than being in your face like the Hawks are,
They're not as arrogant.
We want to be more subdued. We want to hide our capability and bide our time, and slowly, eventually, the Americans will go broke. Right? That's what they're trying to do. What we did to the Soviets is to basically bankrupt them.
Mm-hmm. So that takes me to a point that we've discussed before. Is she a Stalinist? Because it sure looks like that to me. They believe their communist party is the greatest communist party, and every other communist party should be below them, but should follow their lead. And I guess the entire construct of the Stalinist era. If he is that person, can we ever really come to an agreement with him that is measurable, enforceable, and let's say mutually beneficial? Can we ever get there?
Okay, so set Xi aside, just as one person, because that would, everybody would say, well, we'll get another leader and it'll be fine, right?
So the CCP,
since,
can we get somewhere with the Chinese Communist Party?
So in addition to reading the Communist Party constitution, back in 2014 to 2016. I read thousands of pages. One of the documents I read was a internal Communist Party document. It was created in 2013, smuggled out, translated. It's called Document Number 9. Now, if you look at the Bill of Rights, this would be the opposite of the Bill of Rights, right?
The Bill of No Rights.
This is the Bill of No Rights.
Got it.
And so in that in document number 9, they say the Bill of Rights was basically created to destroy the Chinese Communist Party. And we must, at all instances, counteract
Refuse
that.
all of those rights.
We must counteract, not just refuse them, counteract them forcefully, not just within our own borders, but externally, right? So when we talk about, and I talk about in the book, what is 5G about? What is the Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent business model about? It's about creating the architecture, both technologically and business-wise, that allows commerce to flow out of China along with the values that are built into document number 9. Right? So getting you voluntarily to give up free speech for money, to voluntarily give up freedom of religion for more money. Of course, eventually there's going to be an end to it, because what's going to happen is the same thing that happened to the Soviets, is we're going to be essentially bankrupt. That's where we're headed to.
You say that, one would think that the United States does have a moral compass at some point in time, and at some point in time, money will not trump our moral compass pointing north, or at least some version of north. So maybe that stops. So
I would actually say that that's what's going on in Hong Kong right now.
Yes.
So if you could draw a direct line from 1997, which when the
handoff happened,
to 2047,
yeah.
And you say, okay, what they believed in 1997 is that by 2047, certainly the Communist Party is not going to be the same Communist Party. If you draw that straight line, that you could almost predicted that once the Chinese people within Hong Kong realize, okay, they're not going to change.
Right.
There is no way in hell that they want to live in that dystopian,
No.
place in the mainland.
Just be another city in China, right?
They are not. And so people look at, why can't you just get over this?
Why can't they get over the democracy, the liberty, and the freedoms that they've had for the last 100 years? Why can't they just mortgage that and say, you know what, well, we're going to go the Chinese way?
And when we go over there, and even I lived there for 2 years. I lived 2 years in the country. And it's so easy to not actually look under the covers,
right,
and look behind the scenes and see what's going on.
But that's by design.
It's by design, and it's our inability to actually understand, because again, they obfuscate everything they do, what the Chinese Communist Party is and how it built itself within that society.
I'm going to finish our talk here with, if you don't mind, talk about, you are also one of the experts in telecommunications and in the need for the West, and more importantly, the United States, to have a 5G network. And talk to me about China's ascendancy in 5G and what their plan is with Belt and Road and telecom, and owning the data versus what the U.S. is doing, and what the U.S. has got to do to compete on the 5G playing field, and why it's so important. Because I think a lot of people don't understand why that's, call it, vitally important to the United States national security.
So we developed telecommunications. In Bell Labs, which was within AT&T, was the state-of-the-art telecommunications. And then we got out of the business. We stopped investing. So back in the 60s, during the Cold War, we were spending 2% of our GDP on research and development,
R&D,
basic science research. That was going into companies like Bell Labs. That technology is what drove our tremendous economic growth after the end of the Cold War. We stopped doing that. We basically said, we're not going to do R&D anymore. We're going to make private sector do R&D. We're not going to do federal grants for STEM education. So the guys that helped put Americans on the moon, right? They were educated on federal grants, paid for by Uncle Sam, right? So STEM education, we were paying for that. We stopped paying for that. We stopped investing in infrastructure. So now, the highway, the national highway system that we built in the Eisenhower Group, National Highway System, We're now $5 trillion in arrears on that. It's falling apart. And so along all these areas, we just stopped investing in our country. And what happened was, because we said the private sector should do investment. And you know what the private sector did? They invested in China. So they built cities, they built roads, they built telecommunications, they built companies, they built high-speed rail, and now they're building the Belt and Road Initiative, right? All with our money. And so Huawei got to be what it is today by, first of all, being able to steal all of Bell Labs technology, and then having U.S. money investment to help grow it. So,
that's right.
And then they just worked out and started selling. Now, if you fast forward from the world that existed when Alexander Hamilton was basically coming up with the ideas that are in the Constitution, and then you say, okay, what is the purpose of the Second Amendment in the Constitution? First of all, he went through and looked at any government on record to see, what worked, what didn't work, and his goal was to fashion a government where no person, party, organization, or group could gain ultimate power.
Right.
But he said, if we fail, we're going to give the citizens the means to resist that, and that is the Second Amendment.
Second Amendment, yeah.
If you look at what's going on today, you look at the elections in 2016 where the Russians use big data analysis, artificial intelligence bots, and social media to create protests within the United States during the elections, right after the elections. You realize that we've reached a point where in our world, and particularly the world that we're coming to in 5G, the ability to influence you as an individual, or in other words, to oppress you, without either knowing, one, that you're being oppressed, or two, who's doing the oppressing, really means that our world, in terms of how society functions, has gone beyond the point where a gun actually has any relevance in keeping you free anymore.
Right.
Right? Because who are you going to shoot?
Right.
You're just as likely, say the Russians, for them to encourage you to shoot your neighbor because you've been led to believe that your neighbor is your adversary. And so in that world, this is a world, by the way, we designed.
Yeah.
Because we were the second country in the world to build a 4G network. That's a pipe. The platform, Android and Apple, built by two American companies, were built actually to be private data devices. All the app services and business models that were built on top of that platform all accrued to us because we were the second country to build a 4G network and the first country to build a smartphone. So if you go back to 2007 when the iPhone came out, the top 5 in market cap, AT&T, General Electric, ExxonMobil, Shell, and Microsoft. Fast forward 10 years, it's the FANGs, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, and Microsoft. If you fast forward another 10 years from now and you build the 5G network, well, what happens in 5G is a smartphone goes away. You no longer need a phone because the world's wired around you. So you walk out the hotel today and you say, I want an Uber. And a camera picks up your face, knows you are, has facial recognition, reads your lips, or a microphone picks up your voice. Uber shows up, you get in, it bills you. All of that data right now is accessible to the Chinese Communist Party. And then all of a sudden, you decide, Kyle Bass said, I'm going to point out something that the Communist Party did, so I'm going to tweet about it. All of a sudden, the next time you walk outside your door and ask for an Uber, Uber doesn't show up. This is a world. But
that's a world no one wants to live in.
But it is a world that currently exists in China.
I understand.
And actually if you go and live there as a digital citizen,
Their social credit score
they are so far advanced in front of us.
It would make George Orwell blush, right?
It is literally incredible. You walk into a restaurant and a camera picks you up and it says, hey, and the server says, hey, Kyle, here's your food.
Yeah.
Right, that's what's going on. So it's like between a 4G and 5G world.
Why is 5G so important?
Because it is a platform. The mobile phone goes away. So computing and networking are blend. The pipe and the platform for building the apps, services, and business models that are currently being built in China. So Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, just like Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google became dominant. So you had AT&T, General Electric, and Microsoft.
Yeah.
Now you want Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google. What's happening, because China's building the first 5G network, the platform, in China and around the world, they've got 90 countries signed up now. their companies, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, will build the app services and business models on top of that.
I see.
And they will become dominant
But
over
China
Facebook.
will own the data.
They'll own the
They'll own
data.
the data for 90
They'll
countries.
own the data, and
and
they'll
therefore they'll be able to control the narrative.
And the other thing that they're putting in there is electronic payments. So they'll not only control the data, they control the financial flows.
Well, that's their way out of their crazy money printing.
Right.
If they can somehow get these African nations to start accepting their monopoly money, which so
Right.
far hasn't happened. But
Because as you know, as you said, the fact that they don't have dollars really precludes their growth unless they figure out some scheme
the world
to do
still
so.
hasn't accepted their currency, right? Less than
Right.
9/10% of global commerce happens in their currency.
Yeah.
Uh,
In the end, global commerce, finance is all about trust, and
Yeah,
nobody trusts.
no one trusts them.
Right.
And so we need to work as a country with a whole of government approach to exposing, let's say, all the wrongs and the grand strategy of our biggest competitor, and stop letting the Wall Street elite and the Wall Street billionaires evangelize the potential profits of the El Dorado somewhere hiding in China.
And FDR and Winston Churchill showed the way. So the two countries' leaders coming together saying democratic principles, rule of law, free trade, self-determination. This is the system, international system we want to build. So what Secretary Pompeo's State Department officials are going around on a bilateral basis talking to our allies. Either you need to get on board economically, trade-wise, financial, internet, and work with us to right this ship, or we can no longer be a military ally of yours because you're essentially undermining our ability to protect ourselves. Because
Right.
far more than planes, ships, and tanks today, protecting our data and protecting our economic and trade and financial systems really drives geopolitics today.
Yeah.
Greece and the Port of Piraeus really has more to say about how Greece responds to China than how many aircraft carriers we have. In fact,
Right.
Greece doesn't care. Greece doesn't care about.
Well, they already sold the port.
They already sold the port.
So to sum things up, it looks to, basically what you're telling me and telling the world here is China's already fighting on three fronts. They're fighting on the information war side. They're fighting on the cyber war side, which is different, right? They're controlling the narrative and then infiltrating networks and spying and doing whatever they do offensively with cyber. They're also fighting an economic war on a large scale against us today. And the only thing they haven't done yet is launch a conventional weapon against us. But to your point, the next world war is going to be one of those three or a combination of the three, and maybe not even have that fourth one happen. China wants world domination without ever firing a shot, and we've just figured this out. Would you
Right.
say that we've just, as a country, become woke in the last few years?
Yeah, we just become woke. The war's been going. So I believe the way you characterize war has changed.
Yep,
It's fundamentally changed, and it's primarily about finance and economics and information.
correct.
And that information piece being so important is why we said in the national security strategy, we need to build a nationwide secure 5G network. In other words, not only does the government need to protect its own data, which we've become very adept at in
Right.
DoD and the intelligence community, we need to protect your data, right? Because that's what guarantees your rights as a citizen to be free in a 21st century context. And until we figure that out, we can have the greatest Air Force in the world, the greatest Navy, the greatest Army, the greatest Marines. But if we're not protecting your data, we're not protecting your freedom in the world the way we need to today.
General, thanks very much for spending the time. It was an honor and a privilege.
Thank you.
Thank you.